Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of Smoke and Science, the podcast where two cannabis research scientists talk about life and science and other random tangents.
In this episode, we're going to discuss some very important and sometimes controversial terms used in the cannabis industry to describe the overall profile of cannabis plants. We're talking strains, chemovars, and cultivars. We'll talk about what these words mean and when they're applicable, some issues with current and proposed naming systems, and why it is useful to have accurate and descriptive terms. And of course, we want to hear from you. So comment on Smoke and All's most recent Instagram post with what term you prefer to use when describing the diversity of this amazing plant.
Awesome. But first, let's highlight a review from Beth in New Hampshire. Beth says, a rare blend in cannabis science, fact and experience based discussions. Thank you both for dedicating your nerd talents to the field. There is no other podcast that comes close. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to review our podcast, Beth. It helps our podcast tremendously. Also, quite a few of you have reached out to us and said you're sharing the podcast with family and friends, which is so awesome. Thank you so much. Word of mouth is such an important way that we spread the word in our community. Without anything else, are you ready to do this? Let's go.
Woo!
Welcome to Smoke and Science. Nothing but the facts about our favorite plant.
All right, let's dive right into why this topic matters. Why do we need to profile cannabis plants? And I think a lot of this has to do just with how different a cannabis plant can be based on many different factors. And I think the most important thing is people who are using cannabis as medicine, certain compounds work really well with their body, they help their symptoms, and other molecules might not help people or they might actually make them feel worse. So being able to accurately describe what molecules are present in that cannabis plant and in describing that profile can really help people from a medical standpoint.
I think that the term most people are familiar with is the entourage effect when we talk about this combination of effects. The entourage effect was originally used to describe the first use of the entourage effect in scientific literature was actually describing the endocannabinoid system and the combination of things that happen within our body. But it was actually transitioned to describe the plant. And it's we spend a lot of time focusing on THC or CBD, and for good reason. Those molecules are very, very important, but there are so many other molecules that are present in the plant, and a better understanding of how all of them work together is incredibly important, but very, very complicated and very difficult. It's difficult to characterize, especially when modern cultivation is moving forward so quickly and creating so many new awesome strains, cultivars, or chemovars. And it's actually a current debate at what we should be calling these different plants. And something that we're going to talk about is what are they and what does this describe and what are the differences between these three.
Yeah, so you might have heard the word strain before. I think it's definitely the most commonly used term just to describe these different cannabis plants. But you might not have heard of chemovar or cultivar. All these terms are used to describe essentially the same thing, but in different ways. They're used to describe how the cannabis plants differ from each other. So even though you might think that it's just cannabis sativa. They are capable of producing different molecules. The way that they're grown or cultivated is going to facilitate the production of different molecules. And even if you look at a plant, it could be different based on these. So like there's narrow leaf, there's broadleaf varieties. But really what we're going to focus on here is from a molecular standpoint, what these plants can produce and why that's important.
Going into strain as the oldest and most common way of describing these things. Generally speaking, when we were talking about strains, previously there was, I guess, in general, maybe there was the same amount of variability, but there were less strains present when we were relying upon the use of the word strain historically. Now with hybrids and so much genetic variation, it's more difficult to talk about a strain because strains, if we were to originally describe them, strains like OG Kush or Blue Dream, right, or Green Crack, these strains meant more when when there was less variation and less variety of the plants. Even then, it's you could say that we aren't certain how much similarity there was in a strain from grow to grow. And the problem with the word strain is that it does reflect a genetic component, like it does reflect a very specific genetic composition of the plant, but it doesn't always reflect the secondary metabolites or the molecules inside the plant because that can depend upon how it's grown.
Yeah, there's many articles all over the internet that says, don't use the word strain to describe a cannabis plant because strain is a word we use to describe bacteria and fungi, and it's just not scientifically accurate. Well, we're using the word as a communication tool, not to be scientifically accurate. So I think people do need to realize that and be less offended because unless we can educate everyone and agree upon a different way of describing them, I think it's totally fine to keep using the word strain for now.
Well, we need to, that's a great point. We need to have something to be able to communicate these differences because it's not reasonable to say that everyone is going to understand what chemovar or cultivar means, like the nuance between those things. It's not reasonable to just expect that to happen overnight just because we've known for a very long time that the word strain doesn't reflect the chemical profile. We are not there yet where that is something that everyone can easily grasp. And in the meantime, I think it is important to at least describe to people that a different strain means a different plant genetically. And typically that does mean a different secondary metabolite profile if two plants that were genetically different strains were grown under identical conditions. Generally speaking, there are different strains that come up with different chemical profiles reliably. It's just that the complicated factor is all the variables that go into, like, from genetics of the plant into what actually comes out in the flower.
Yeah, I think strain is the best way to just describe what we're used to, as Miyabi just said, of the different plants with these different names. They make you feel different, probably because they have different chemicals present. But also, let's just define what these mean. So, a chemovar is a chemical variety, and a cultivar is a cultivated variety. So, if you were cultivating OG Kush, then that would be your cultivar. Or for chemovar, you could say, so here we're going to focus on the chemical profile. So here you could say, this chemovar is high in the terpene beta caryophyllene. It has moderately high THC content, etc. So we're focusing on the chemicals in this state. Another term you may hear is pheno or phenotype when describing different cultivars. Phenotype is referring to traits that we can observe in the plant. So something like the smell and the color of the plant. So when we're cultivating, creating different hybrids, the female is going to produce seeds. And when we plant these seeds and grow them, although they come from the same plant, they may express slightly different profiles, and we can choose the one that's most attractive for what we're looking for based on phenotype.
So I think the most accurate thing scientifically would to have a cultivar and chemovar a pair, right? To have both of those things because the cultivar describes the genetic composition and how it was grown, and then the chemovar describes the molecules that come out of that if you were to do that reliably. But I still think that that's a very difficult ask. And in general, there's this concept of strain and the genetic composition of the flower, and that in general there are things that can be said that are generalized things about strains that used to be more true when there were less hybrids, but that still remain true. There was a pretty recent publication on genotyping, which is figuring out the genetic sequence of cannabis, the cannabis plant, And they were looking at the actual DNA of the plants that were indica versus sativa. So this was not hybrid. They weren't looking at hybrids. They were looking at the difference between indica and sativa strains. And the indica and sativa plants in these strains look very physically different. And in this recent study, they showed that they had clear genetic differences between indicas and sativas, and that those genetic differences led to very specific terpenes being upregulated or downregulated in general. And again, this isn't to say like every indica is couch. Like
Yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily true, right?
Yeah,
But
so the reason it's so important, or why scientists think it's so important to genetically profile these plants, is because when we look at the genes in a plant, that can tell us what compounds that plant is capable of producing. So if a gene to produce a specific terpene, say alpha pinene, say that gene is not present in a certain plant, then we know that that plant is not genetically capable of producing that terpene. But if it contained that gene, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to produce alpha pinene. It means that it's capable of producing it. So this is where we go back to the cultivation aspect of that, because depending on how you cultivate your plants, it could upregulate certain molecules being produced, or it could downregulate certain molecules being produced, because all of these important molecules that we love that have these medicinal benefits, they're called secondary metabolites because the plant is producing these molecules for some purpose. So whether you're growing indoor or outdoor or hydroponic, that is going to change the profile that your plant produces. Because if it's outdoor, it's going to be exposed to a lot more bacteria, fungi, sunlight that differs on the amount of radiation that's actually reaching the plant. So you might have a less reliable profile, but there might be certain molecules that are upregulated when grown in certain conditions.
there's preliminary evidence that there are very specific differences between each of these scenarios: outdoor, indoor, hydroponic, soil choice, all of these things. We don't actually like fully understand how that then plays out in the final formulation. We can make assumptions about like cannabinoids and terpenes that we screen, but there are still hundreds and hundreds of molecules that we don't look at, and that the whole entire profile of a full spectrum extract or a flower or smokable, any smokable products, is much more diverse than that of even like the chemovar that it describes. And I think pointing out that secondary metabolites are a stress response is such an important piece. It's, the evolution of why these molecules exist is fascinating. And
Oh
the
yeah.
fact that they are produced in response to very specific stresses, they serve a purpose for the plant. And that's something that, we both are really passionate about talking about how that translates over into how it affects us as humans. And one of the reasons why it's a different effect, I guess, than if you were to have an isolated product or have any sort of isolated or synthetic derivative of something, it would not have that same diversity or that same number of molecules. And I think that's something that's amazing about cannabis, and it's incredible. That's why having so many strains is interesting. There's like, I think there should be way more research done on growing in different environmental conditions because there are different stresses. But
Oh,
this
even altitude. Altitude even plays a huge role in what molecules are produced.
There is so much cool research that I think is yet to be, we're yet to like even be scraping the surface on that, let alone like dry cure and that piece of it and how that affects the total chemovar at the end of the day. So that's actually something we didn't mention before, but another thing that affects the final product is how it is treated after the plant is grown. Uh, and I totally think that we have yet to even fully explore all the possible combinations that exist, but that the reason why consumers, and not just consumers but everyone, I mean, as a scientist, it's easy to say, oh, everyone should stop using the word strain. Everyone should start using the technically correct term. That's easy to say when the purpose of what you're doing is to study the
Yeah.
plants. That it's easier to say that because for us, that is the purpose, right? Like our purpose as scientists would be to understand that chemical difference and or the cultivated difference, how it was grown differently. But as a consumer in the general population, it's not as simple as that because it's more reliable, I would say, to be able to like generally speaking weed out certain large generalizations. Like, and it's not always going to hold true, but a large generalization for some people is that pinene might cause them anxiety. And pinene is generally speaking higher in sativa leaning strains. Not always, right? Like
Yeah.
this isn't.
Yeah.
That's the complicated thing with cannabis is that it's not always true.
There's
Um,
very few like very definitive rules when we're talking about the profiles of these plants.
and it's not always true for every person at the same time either, because there's an entourage effect going on inside of every one of our brains all the time.
I'm so glad you brought this up because I think we love to generalize how certain strains make us feel. They're uplifting, they're energetic, etc. But that cannot be the same for everyone. We all have different endocannabinoid systems. These molecules are going to affect us differently based on how our body operates. So we can't really generalize to that degree. And if we do generalize, we're generalizing for a certain amount of the population and not for everyone.
Yeah, and that's often pointed to that variability is pointed to as a negative of cannabis with medical users, and it's pointed as a negative because it is different. It's a difference from the traditional pharmaceutical route of like an isolated compound that also has some variability in response to people. Generally speaking, like especially if you're talking about things that are like psychoactive, there is a good amount of variation between the way that people will respond to things, but it's far less because the actual molecule is exactly the same. The actual dose of the molecule is the same, and you could count on, generally speaking, like the amount that reaches the brain or the body of most people remains kind of the same, which for cannabis and cannabinoids, there are huge differences. Part of that difference is like fat metabolism, the ability of people to absorb fats from their diets. Like, I think we haven't yet looked at the microbiome or changes in like gut microbiota and how we like internalize this. But yeah, I guess what do you think? I've got a question for you about what do you think about like the use of strain and evolving a consumer's education from the use of strain to something that's more like a chemovar or a cultivar, because to me I think that's the goal, would be an evolution of that. I don't know, what do you think
Oh,
about that?
I think the goal is definitely evolving and creating a standardized way, but I think it's going to involve grouping. And there's a lot of publications that are leaning towards this, like grouping a bunch of these strains that we're used to together into a type. So, say there's six different types and they differ just based on their overall profile. But if you were to like take the average of those molecules, like you could create a type. So then you say, okay, we have six or eight types. And then it's a lot easier to track how you feel. Like type 2 cannabis, I don't know if we would call them chemovars at this point, but let's say it is. So type 2 cannabis chemovars, they work really well for my body. They help with my symptoms I'm using cannabis to treat with. But my question always is, if we're going to make this change, who is leading? Who's in charge of the education? Like, where do we go to for this information? Because right now we don't really have a system in place.
And that's a huge problem when it comes to people going to different places and finding and trying different things and understanding. Right now it's trial and error, I suppose, would be the best advice that most people could give, is that you go, and the problem is, if someone's new or being introduced to it and they get the wrong recommendation, it could easily turn them off from thinking that anything could ever help, especially if it's something that could be exacerbated. Both pain and anxiety and certain things like THC can both increase or decrease it depending on its combination. So.
Well, and just like consistency overall, right? We know that a certain strain grown in California and grown in Massachusetts is not going to have the same profile exactly. And even a strain grown in the same greenhouse, like from the same plant, is still going to have a slightly different profile. So it is kind of hard to just group them all together and say, okay, OG Kush is OG Kush because is it? Are we actually, do we have any method of confirming that that profile is consistent? So if one day I use OG Kush and I say, this is the best strain I've ever used for my fibromyalgia, and then I go back to it and I'm like, ooh, that didn't really work for me this time. Is it because your body has changed in some way, or is it because the profile of that strain has changed in some way that you as a consumer don't really have the ability to track?
The way to do that would be this like an incredibly rigorous, I guess, testing of genetics and the chemovar that comes out of the way that it's cultivated. There is a group. This was an interesting study, and I'm blanking on the group name, so I'm not going to speak it. But they were up in Canada, and I saw a presentation like this was a few years ago now, and it was a really interesting thing. They only offered, I think it was six different strains, cultivars, chemovars, whatever we want to call them. They only offered six. And they took very, very careful care of genotyping and using tissue culture to always get and confirm that they always were using the same identical genotype for these plants. And then they went through really, really rigorous grow conditions so that their cultivars of these were always exactly the same because they were grown in the same conditions. And then they even tested the chemovars coming out of it and went through and profiled it. And they asked their consumer base, hey, if there's one new thing that you want, like what is another thing that we could bring in that you don't see that we have? And I remember that it was Northern Lights because I like Northern Lights. And I
I
was
do
like,
too.
out of all things that I remembered, it was that. And I was like, oh, they wanted Northern Lights. Cool. I would have also requested that. But yeah, so they wanted Northern Lights. And the interesting thing was that then this company they went through and they were like, okay, let's bring Northern Lights in, we'll get the genetics going through, and they tested it. And when they got a stable genetic strain and under the same cultivation conditions and they tested it, they saw that the chemovar, or the molecules that are inside the plant of Northern Lights, was distinctly different from the other six or eight that they were offering. So I thought that was super interesting because it does indicate that it's possible for us to understand these complex formulations and that they do have different effects for people. I just want to take a moment to point out how cool it is that we are able to identify things based on strain, even though it's not always perfect. And even though there is still a lot of variability, there is strain specificity, and we are able to identify it in the effects. So far, those of you who have answered our polls on social media still prefer to use strain as the descripting factor for different types of cannabis. And I just wanted to point out that even though it's not perfect, it is still a way to describe the different types of cannabis, and it can, in general, describe the effects. And while we're still figuring out exactly how all of that works together, it is one of the major positives of cannabis that it's there, because this is why cannabis can work for so many people and for so many different symptoms chemically.
Oh, like many things, absolutely. So, I mean, you were talking about how we would need more rigorous lab testing to be able to profile these. And I would totally agree with that. But, like, where is the practicality here? Because we already know lab testing's a bottleneck. We already know it's super expensive and sometimes unreliable. So, we can't expect cannabis analytical labs to essentially do metabolomics, which is like looking at every single molecule that the plant makes and mapping it. We can't expect them to do that with every sample. But similar to the study that you pointed out, I don't even know if we're talking about the same study here. But I believe the study that I'm referencing now was, oh my gosh, I think it was a Dutch study. And again, they took 460 different types of cannabis and they mapped it on a PCA plot, principal component analysis plot. So it's kind of grouped based on similarity. And there was six different types that the government offered patients. And what they found was really cool is they noticed there were some gaps. So there was some profiles that were not being offered by the government. So at the same time, simultaneously, but without communication, a Dutch advocate group actually said, hey, we want more amnesia type strains. And when they actually checked out one of the giant gaps in their data, it was corresponding to amnesia type strains. So it was so cool that people could actually identify that there was a gap of medicine that they were missing from availability to them. And they could identify what type of cannabis that was just from personal experience. And that perfectly aligned with the science.
I I love that when it fits like
It's
that.
so
Like,
cool.
well, but what this indicates is that we as patients and consumers are capable of identifying these differences, and that they have qualitatively different effects that are discernible, and that we it's clear to us that we can feel them and that they exist. They aren't just like imaginary differences between the plants and the molecules. The entourage effect is real in terms of the combination, and it's just about understanding the best way possible to do this. I would say that as opposed to testing like what you were just describing, like being like adding additional tests, like cannabis is already very much so under a magnifying glass of testing that's held to very, very rigorous standards. And just in terms of like the practicality of that, I don't know. I'd say the easier variable to fix would be cultivation, but that would require everyone cultivating to adopt the same thing, which also is unreasonable and also limits ingenuity. It
Yeah, I
limits
was gonna
like
say that kind of goes against the culture of
right.
cultivation. I mean, people are doing their own experiments, they're creating their own hybrids. You're really just having a lot of people are having fun with cultivation and creating these really unique plants. And if we try to standardize that, I feel like we're just kind of moving in the wrong direction.
I totally agree because well, so this is an interesting point where if we were to standardize it, so I guess we are trying to make the one of the big issues here is trying to make cannabis fit as a square into a round hole or a circle into a square hole. We're trying to make cannabis fit into something that is more pharmaceutical in nature. There are definite advantages to pharmaceuticals. I'm not saying that pharmaceuticals in any way is negative. I dislike the idea that we should be competing with any space for pharmaceuticals, but rather just that they could complement each other, but that they are different, that they're inherently different advantages to cannabis. And I agree with you that it would be to standardize the cultivation would be incredibly limiting, and I think it would do a detriment overall. At the same time, it would limit variables, which shifts things more into that pharmaceutical realm. Not that there isn't enough of a cannabis market for either side, because I think there are people who want both, right? Like both
I do think
advantages.
kind of somewhere we could meet in the middle, and this is just opinion, like most things that come out of my mouth. But but I think kind of separating medical versus recreational is gonna help with this. So again, if medical patients need a very specific profile to alleviate their symptoms, they should be able to get super reliable medicine, and that's going to come from rigorous lab testing, rigorous cultivation environments, and then we can get those people consistent medicine. Now, for recreational users like myself, I think we can still just have an absolute party making these different hybrids, trying out different cultivation techniques, showing our friends, hey, like I just grew this, it's really cool. I think it's kind of this profile, but let me know what you think. It's not like my health depends on that strain or that chemovar. It's really for that it's recreational, but for medical, I do think we need a lot more rigor.
Just playing devil's advocate, what
Hell
if
yeah.
what if an amazing strain comes out of that party that has medical advantages that aren't present in the other? That's the problem, right?
No,
Like
it's not a problem. I think that's it's kind of how the field could adapt over time, right? So we have, and this is kind of similar to the Dutch study I was talking about. We have these 6 or 7 different chemovars that we know have a ton of medical benefits for people, and people are allowed to try whatever they want, see what works for them, talk to their doctor about it, whatever. And then as people are cultivating and trying new things, if someone thinks they have something really powerful, they can like submit that essentially to whatever body is overlooking this and say, hey, I think we have a really unique chemical profile here. I think this could really help people from a medical standpoint. And you could kind of submit it. And then you run that and say, is this different enough from the other ones offered to medical patients that we should now incorporate this as number 8 that's available to people? And then kind of move forward. And then maybe eventually there's like 20 that are available for a medical standpoint that are all unique, all different, but are still rigorously tested for chemical profile, for pesticides, for everything.
So okay, so what about this? What about this idea? Because I still think another piece of this puzzle will be figuring out how to, like, what regulating body and how does everyone get on board with the same thing and that standardization. So what about this? What if in the initial of, in terms of coming from the consumer angle of saying that instead of trying to amend the industry or change the industry at all, coming at it with how do you help the consumer, medical versus recreational, evolve past like strain, chemovar, cultivar, that the advice would be in the beginning to look at generalized things like indica leaning, sativa leaning strains, trying things. It's still going to be a little bit of trial and error. Like, I definitely think there will always still be.
Almost like a flow chart. Like,
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
like if this worked, try this. If this didn't work, try this. Or like it kind of
And then
guides you.
like an eye doctor. Okay, like when you go to the eye doctors and you sit behind the thing, you have perfect vision, huh? So I don't know if you know
I
what I'm talking
do.
about. You don't know what I'm talking about then. But okay. Well, no, you've been to the eye doctor probably.
I
Okay,
have.
so
I have.
it's okay. Like you're sitting behind the thing and they're like, is this one better? Is this one better? And then when you answer, they like lock it in. And then they go to the next thing and they're like, is this one better? Or is this one better? And then they lock that in. And then eventually at the end of it, you're somehow given a prescription with like numbers, and or you have perfect vision and you don't need glasses. But but
Well,
what
it's
if it was
also like I think we could totally adapt what you're saying, but also have it like symptomology based. So if as science advances and as we're allowed to study cannabis more, maybe we figure out that certain symptomologies can be helped with certain molecules. And then we can start building like your personalized profile based on you. And I mean, this could probably be done from like a genetic standpoint too, but I'm less than favorable about that. I think it's more of like a questionnaire kind of thing. And then you could kind of point you to recommended chemovars that you then try out and you say, wow, yeah, this really helped with these symptoms, didn't really help with these symptoms. Then you try another one and you kind of build your desired profile around that.
Hi, this is Andy with Smoke and All. In this episode, Riley and Miyabi have done an excellent job explaining the differences between strain, cultivar, and chemovar. These words mean different things, and it is appropriate to use them at different times. The differences between these words may not be as big as some people might think, but they're important to understand. Being able to describe these plants, the molecules in these plants, and how those molecules in these different plants might affect people differently is important. Patients and consumers need education and information to make informed decisions, and we believe that will lead to more positive outcomes. A little word from Smoke and All, and we'll be right back to the science. Smoke and All is a unique cannabis extract that feels more like smoking compared to traditional edibles. That's because it's actually extracted from cannabis smoke. Smoke and All can be incorporated into a variety of formulations, including edibles, tinctures, and capsules. And Smoke and All extraction is fast, easy, and requires very little upfront investment. If you work at a dispensary or are involved in cannabis processing and are interested in incorporating Smoke and All formulations for your products, contact the link below or send us a message on Instagram. Smoke and All. We smoked it for you.
All right, we are back and we're going to keep talking about strains, chemovars, and cultivars. We kind of were just talking about how difficult it can be to profile these different types of cannabis. And I think a lot of people might think, okay, well, the easy thing to do would just be to create a bunch of different isolates. So just an isolated pure compound. So either just THC or just CBD or just even isolated terps. Um, which would be more in that pharmaceutical realm, but that defies everything that the cannabis community stands for, and it would defeat the purpose of using cannabis as medicine, in my opinion. What do you think about this?
It's so complicated because I agree. The topic of today's podcast is really the chemovars, cultivars, strains. Why do we struggle through this, and why is there that struggle? The other aspect of it saying, why don't we do what we do with all of the other natural products, which is isolate the active components and then reformulate them. I don't think that there's like zero value to that. I think that it is valuable, and I think that it's useful for certain people and et cetera. But I mean, both of us are plant people,
Yeah.
and it's incredible that the plant is alive, and I very much so believe that the fact that it is alive and that these molecules come from living things, it's not just the molecules themselves coming from the living thing. It's the fact that a complex organism like the plant creates the molecules while it is alive. I think that the restrictions of life upon the plant make the formulations different. In order to get a flower, in order to bring your plant to flower, it has to live through the veg state, or it has to live enough to be able to flower, right?
And
Yeah.
those different the molecules are not just interacting with our body, the molecules are interacting with each other in these really complex extracts and formulations. So we don't even know the degree to the complexity of what we're putting in our body, but we know that there's some synergy with that cannabis plant in our body because we have cannabinoid receptors that we know that the cannabinoids can bind to. We're still learning a lot about terpenes, what receptors they can bind to in our body, the potential medicinal benefits from the terpenes combined with the cannabinoids. And just it's an extremely diverse picture, which some people might say, oh, it's too diverse to use as medicine. But in my opinion, it's the best medicine because there's so many different ways we can formulate based on our needs and our body.
And there are other advantages, right, to complex formulations versus isolates that don't often get touched upon. But an example is like possible synergies in formulations. But just in general, if you have a more complex mixture, typically if you have more than one molecule that has a synergy with it, you need less of both of those molecules. Also, just in general, negative side effects, off targets, or like negative, any sort of negative effect that one molecule can have, most of those things are linked to the amount of that molecule that is there. It's something that's called like a dose dependent effect. And if you are, for example, THC tolerance is a dose dependent effect. Negative aspects of THC tolerance and withdrawal, like
Well, tolerance
CHS.
in general, right? Tolerance in general is dose dependent. What
Yes.
no matter what the molecule we're talking about.
That
But
no, that's absolutely yeah, you're totally right there. It's and the biphasic nature of most molecules, but THC too, right? That at low levels THC can decrease anxiety. At high levels, it increases anxiety. Um, those things would not happen if you had less THC because there were other molecules there that were supplementing THC so that you get the overall same benefit effect with like a smaller dose of that one molecule that causes the negative effects. And yeah, isolates have their place. I certainly think that they're valuable. I think that there is value in moving that direction and that there will be a population of people that will be helped by that and by, the reproducibility that can come from that. But I think that the untapped potential lies still in the complex combination that comes from the plant.
yeah, absolutely. And I just think I mean, I want your opinion on this, but do you think doctors or practitioners, medical doctors would be more in favor of cannabis as medicine if it was isolated products, because I think part of the reason is it's really hard for doctors to track patients' progress or even the molecules that the patients are putting in their body, the ones that could potentially be helping or hurting, especially when molecules like THC and CBD are biphasic. They're going to cause different responses at different concentrations. But I know, well, first let's talk about that, and then I'll move forward.
I I think that that's exactly the reason why people are shying away from it, but it's a reason that is given too much stature in my opinion because there's more fear going on than necessary. Like for example, the harm like so cannabis is not toxic. The molecules in cannabis are very well tolerated by
Very
humans.
safe.
Very
Yeah.
safe. And so if you're using them, especially if you were to use them in very low doses as an introduction or a trial and error of whether or not something would work for someone, the potential negative there is very, very small, minuscule, almost impossible to see the negative risk, especially when you're comparing it to other medicines that all have their positives and negatives as well. So I think that might be the disconnect is the relative harm because doctors take an oath to say that they'll do no harm and that they'll
Yep.
always do the best by their patients. And I genuinely do believe that doctors are doing that. The problem is when whether they're aware of that true like cost to benefit ratio of cannabis in relation to the other things that are being prescribed or in relation to nothing at all. Um,
Well, and I don't know if you talked to your doctor about cannabis. I know a lot of people are not comfortable with it. I wasn't for a super long time. But what do they ask you? They ask you, "Do you use cannabis?" They don't there's so many more specific things that we need to bring up in conversation because cannabis isn't really this blanket statement. It can be so different.
I think my current PCP that I have knows that I've used cannabis or that I use cannabis, but recently I was rereading a test that I had undergone where I was like, "Oh, I certainly lied." Like, I definitely underplayed. I think it said something like I take one hit per week or something.
Well, right. And it's like it's really hard to be honest if someone isn't used to using cannabis because you don't want to say to your doctor like, yeah, I hit my bong 7 times a day because then they might be like, oh my gosh, that's so much or whatever. It's just there's always judgment and this is the same thing with drinking too. There's like classic memes about your doctor asking you, how many drinks do you have a week? And you say 1 to 2, but it's
Or you say
usually like
one glass of
11
red
to 12.
wine. Yeah, like
Yeah, exactly.
one glass of red wine for the resveratrol to help with the
Right. I strictly drink red wine for the antioxidants. That's
yeah.
all.
Well, well, I think that it's to a fault that it still has to do with like a lack of education in that realm about cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. There's cannabis use disorder and this very negative like this idea that you get flagged as an addict. I have been flagged for that before in my history. It does change the way that you're treated and prescribed moving forward if you have that on like in the file or
Right. It's in your
whatnot.
file now. Like, you don't know people's perception of you after they read that because a lot of people still perceive cannabis as this kind of druggy mentality, stoner, whatever. But there's so many benefits to it, and I think we need to do better on just making that more accepted. But it's going to take time and
Yeah.
legalization.
The other problem is that chronic users, like daily users, we are the population of people that should be talking to our doctors about it. We are the population of people that would benefit the most from having outside perspective on like having it help with your uses. The issue is finding like educated and open people, and they definitely exist. It's possible. It's just a lot of like effort, and there's this whole dance of whether or not you feel comfortable or safe. And I definitely think having the data that something is helping you doesn't always mean that that's the way that the data is going to be interpreted, doesn't always mean that that's the way other people are going to see it. I actually is why I got my PhD was to be like, oh, I can explain to you the molecular mechanism because otherwise no one believes me.
Yeah, I mean, and we could probably talk about this for years. It's just such an important topic. And we're not pressuring anyone to talk to their doctors if they're not comfortable. It takes a long time to get to that point, and do whatever you feel is most comfortable for you and most beneficial for your health. But I do think we should talk about one more subject on this podcast episode, and that's that even though we have these super diverse formulations with all these different molecules in cannabis, whether you're using a vape or an edible or smoking, it's actually going to change what molecules enter your body.
Yeah, pretty much no matter what, they're altered. I think the only way that they wouldn't be altered, and I'm not advocating for this at all, I'm just stating that the only way that the molecule would be totally unaltered would be by IV, in theory.
Right.
Although I
Definitely
guess
not advocating.
no. Although sublingual, I think, and subbuccal, right, and suppositories
So
too.
essentially,
Or,
what we're
no, that's
talking
minimal.
about,
Sorry.
yeah, I think minimal. But it's beyond just metabolism. What we're talking about here, what we're saying is, if you were to take a plant and you take a bunch of bud and you make a bunch of different products from that same plant, so technically speaking, has the same metabolite profile. If we were to put that into an edible and then smoke it and vape it, when we smoke it, that heat is going to transform some of those molecules into new molecules that are going to interact with your body in a new way. So, like THC partially turns into CBN when it's smoked. There's some degrees of other chemical rearrangements and chemical changes. And this isn't saying this is a bad thing. It's just saying it changes. It's going to make you feel different, not only based on what strain you're using, but based on the consumption method.
Right. And that these molecules, even if they're present only in small amounts, they compete for parts of the same receptor. They compete for the enzymes that break them down. They might even bind to the outside and alter the way that these existing molecules interact. And we don't quite understand like that very, very complicated interaction at multiple receptor types and how all those systems come into play. What we do understand is that it is somewhat specific to strains, cultivars, chemovars, and I think it would be great to hear from all of you, to hear from everyone what you think moving forward is the best thing to do. From that scientist perspective, I've said for a long time that we should move away from generalizing like indica, sativa as like large generalizations. I'm actually I think backing away from that the more experience that I get being outside of the scientific environment because it's a tangible, very quick and easy categorization. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, again, it's like we got to think about communication, how we're communicating these things. If someone is brand new to cannabis, they enter a dispensary and you hit them with like these crazy terms talking about these chemovars that are high in a certain molecule that they've never heard of, et cetera, that's going to be really off-putting to their experience. It's not going to be an attractive situation for them. They probably will just be off put by cannabis for a little while. Whereas instead, if you enter a dispensary and you talk to a bud tender and they're like, hey, like, what are you really looking for cannabis for? Oh, you're looking for sleep. Oh, can I recommend an indica that's going to help you really relax and feel sleepy? Then that person might go, oh, I totally get what you're talking about. That sounds great. I would love to try this, etc. And then I think also just bud tenders, educators, everyone just emphasizing the importance of writing down what you're trying and writing down how that makes you feel. You don't need to be exact in your notes. You could just say like, hey, I tried, I don't know, I'm just going to keep talking about OG Kush. So I tried OG Kush, made me feel good, very sleepy, munchies were strong. I don't know, just very simple notes. I think it's important to note that it's okay to be adaptive with your language based on who you're talking to. So, for instance, if I'm talking to someone who's completely new to cannabis, maybe I'm going to use the word strain to describe the different varieties. If I'm a cannabis cultivator talking to another cultivator, maybe at that point I use the word cultivar to describe the different varieties. And if I'm an MD talking to a scientist, maybe at that point I say chemovar. But I think it's important that we're adaptive and understanding with the language that we're using to describe cannabis because it is extremely complex.
Yeah, I'm going to second the taking notes part. And I think that when it comes to educating and consumers and the take home of the strains, chemovars, cultivars, is that we are just at the tip of the iceberg of understanding what this all means, which also means that we're at the tip of the iceberg and identifying like the important piece of it for all of us to understand and to communicate, which I'm excited to see. I used to just like smoke what I could get. I guess would be the way that it would work like right before, and it's very different to be able to choose and be able to identify many of these things. And one more thing on introducing people to cannabis, I guess, and new consumers is that in theory, if you were introducing a new consumer to cannabis and you wanted to see if any of the effects would be beneficial, in my opinion, a more chemo diverse product would be more ideal. But that's just because you're increasing the chance that something will work for them if there is a very specific cannabinoid that works for specific symptoms that they're looking for, and or just in general that if something is more chemodiverse, you're less likely to have some of the more negative effects that can come from, overstimulating just the CB1 receptor with delta 9 THC. So I think that's probably self-explanatory, but if you have a new consumer, you're not like, hey, why don't you take this giant dab of highly concentrated THC?
I
Start
totally agree.
small.
Always start small. It's like we call it titrating. So essentially just like finding your right dose, but slowly finding your right dose, starting small. Did this make me feel good? Was this alleviating my symptoms? Did I feel anything? And then maybe trying a little bit more than that, et cetera. Little steps up. You don't go from 1 milligram, a 1 milligram edible to 100 milligram edible. That's a pretty large step. But also something I would suggest for anyone listening to this is just being patient with people who don't know a lot about cannabis. It's an extremely complex subject. And if someone does use the word strain or indica or sativa, which most of us do, and you don't agree with that, I wouldn't come at that person and say, we don't use those words because XYZ. You could say, hey, I prefer to use this term because it describes this better, and just kind of taking out that negative tone and just being understanding that we're all at different places in cannabis as medicine and education.
We used to have that culture when you bring someone into it, you're bringing someone in new, and it's kind of like they are like, I remember the first time for me with a lot of my friends, right? Like bringing someone into that culture. And I think it's different. Now it's just, we should bring a little bit of that back. All right. So
I agree. Like helping someone even like light a bowl. Like a lot of people don't know how to use lighters. Like, here, let me help you.
Let me show you what the carb is, right? Like
exactly. Yeah. Well, thanks again for listening to this episode of Smokin' Science about strains, chemovars, and cultivars. We are going to be posting an Instagram post on our Smokin' All page that's going to refer to this episode.
So if you want to just comment on that post and let us know which one you prefer and why, and or your thoughts on what we described we should be working on as a community moving forward. Thank you all so much for listening. We love interacting with you on social media, and we're going to include you as much as we can. So let us know what you think, and thanks again for listening to Smokin' Science.
Thanks, fam.